So, buenos tardes, todos. I'd like to thank everyone for coming to my session. I'm going to talk about custom compound fields in Drupal 8. So, just real quick to let me introduce myself. My name is Toby Hagler. I am Director of Engineering of our product delivery group at Phase 2 Technologies. I've been a Drupal architect long before that. I've been working with Drupal since about Drupal 4.5. At least my first project for work was. I've written and talked about compound fields in the past, manipulating field API, including a blog post that's surprisingly still online. I've also spoken at DrupalCon about a couple of other sessions. I've been on projects such as NBA.com, WeightWatchers.com, which makes use of a lot of compound fields, and Memorial Sloan Kettering, which was the first really large Drupal 8 site. So just to start off, I'd like to start off with a simple question. What is a compound field? Well, simply put, a compound field is just made up of smaller elements. Sometimes we're going to refer to this as atoms that make up a larger molecule. So to give you an idea, the atomic content model is something that's real important to consider when you're putting together the content model for your project or your website. You'll hear a lot about this too from front-end Drupal developers as atomic design. You have fields. Fields are the smallest atomic elements, the smallest piece of data that you can have. These produce compound fields. These are molecules, and we'll focus on this more later. Organisms are the content piece of the page that you're looking at. You can think of this as the node content, such as a recipe. Templates, of course, contain all the placeholders for everything, which then turn into pages, which is the complete structure that we serve for the end user. So the address field, for instance, provides a really good example of what a compound field looks like. When you add an address to a node or to a user entity, it's treated as a single field, right? But this single field is composed of many separate elements or atoms, such as the street, city, province, country. And each address then is a molecule comprised of these individual atoms. Going the wrong way. So, talking about creating custom compound fields. So the address model, the address module is a really good example in Drupal 8 of a compound field. And there's other really good examples of compound fields out there that provide other bits of functionality provided by the Drupal community. And so the first thing you want to do before you start thinking about creating a custom compound field is to see if you can find it in an existing contrib module that already exists. Something that already does what you need. But what happens when you have a use case that isn't met by an existing module? How do you create your own custom compound field? So there's a couple of options that you have at your disposal. The paragraphs module is probably the most common approach. It's something that's it's a very mature module. It's existed since at least Drupal 7. A lot of Drupal 7 sites use it. It's very common in Drupal 8. You can create your own field type and field widgets using Field API. You can create a custom module for that. Some other modules out there that replicate a lot of what paragraphs do. They may not be the most ideal thing, but I'm going to talk about them briefly just so that you're aware of their existence and what they do. So one of the examples that I like to give when you're thinking about compound fields is to look at a recipe. A recipe is an overall big piece of content. It might be the organism that we care about that's comprised of a number of fields, but essentially it's made up of a lot of ingredients. And these ingredients represent a molecule, and the ingredients may have additional field elements, these individual atoms. And you'll see here that you have quantity and unit, the name of the ingredient, maybe a note. And so that's a really good example of using compound fields in everyday content modeling. I should note, by the way, that the recipe module does actually exist now. When I first started using recipe years ago as a sort of analogy for talking about compound fields, it wasn't something that existed, but as any good community member would know, if there's a need in the community, there's a need to create some module that other people could use. Somebody did that, so congratulations. But I still like to use this example because it's a very easy thing to discuss, and it's something that people are very familiar with. So I'm going to run through this first part a little bit fast just because of the sake of time. I know a couple of sessions are starting to run a little bit late, and I don't want to bleed into the next one. But exploring our options, the first thing that comes to mind, of course, is to use the paragraphs module. This module, it lets you create a paragraphs entity that you can then use like a field on your content type, and it can be made up of other Drupal fields. You can even create paragraph types, which are something akin to content types. Some feedback, maybe. So when you're creating a paragraph type, it's going to be very similar to the approach you would take to creating a content type of a node. It's very similar. A paragraph is still an entity, just like a node is an entity. All entities in Drupal 8 are fieldable, so the process is going to be really much the same. So you're essentially you're creating an entity just like any other node and add fields to it. The resulting paragraph bundle will be a single field. It's used as a field on a node that can be added to content types or any other fieldable entity, such as a taxonomy term, a user, or even just a custom block. So I want to show you just a quick example of a compound field using paragraphs. I'm not going to use the recipe analogy here right away, but so this is something that's just called a quote that appears on a couple of sites. In this quote, it contains an image, it contains the source or attribution, it contains a link to another piece of content. In this particular case, it's called the program. And you'll see that in the rendered version of this quote, that you see how the image looks, you see how the quote text looks, but all of these different atomic elements come together to form the molecule that is the quote. And so here we see the zoomed in portion of the node edit form for editing just a new quote. So here we're adding an image, you upload an image, it's just a normal field. We fill out the quote text and the source values, and on the content type, this quote is going to be just a single field, even though it's presenting you with 4 different field widgets for each data point on the quote field. So here we see the same quote rendered again with our new dummy image here. Each quote is rendered as a single field entity on the page, and the node template, this would be something like content.quote. If you're looking at the node template, right? So it's just content.quote, and that field is rendered as you see here. And since at the node level, there's no need to worry about rendering each individual atomic piece of each individual element of the quote, it's all handled at the paragraph level. So just real quick to touch on theming of paragraphs, the reason you don't need to worry about this at the node or the field level is because since paragraph types are an entity unto themselves, they have their own templates. You can put these templates into your theme. So the quote paragraph theme, the template renders each atomic field as needed. It puts it in the right place, it puts the markup around it. And then the paragraph is rendered as a single molecule on the node page. So paragraphs is the first place I'll look to create custom compound fields because it's a really simple way to do it. It's something that you can create through the UI, you can export through config. It's something that anybody can come along and create pretty easily. However, you may have a use case where the requirements aren't going to be met by creating a simple paragraph type. So for instance, let's say you need to use a field that's going to incorporate a custom widget, like a color picker with your little eyedropper, or something to let you put in RGB values, a special date picker that's going to have some calendar widget, Say your client has written a JavaScript widget that they want you to use rather than using like an existing jQuery widget or something that already exists with a date module, or something that's going to go fetch content from an external source, and you just need to have the ability to create a widget to allow the user to capture that information. So in this case, you might want to use, create a custom field using Drupal's field API. So when you're creating a new field, there's going to be 3 elements to consider. You're going to have the field type itself, which includes the database schema that's going to capture all your different data points for your field. You're going to have the field formatter, which outputs your field data. And third, you're going to have the field widget, which is the thing that accepts input from the admin user. So let's go back to our recipe analogy. If we take a look at our recipe content type and its list of fields, you'll see the ingredients field with the field type of ingredient. All the other fields look pretty normal. You have numbers, you have text elements. That's all things you're going to see on any other content type. So just using Drupal core fields, it's the ingredient content type or the ingredient field type that sticks out. So when you're going to create a new module to create a new field type, so let's take a look at the file structure. So the first thing I want to call out is there's a great tutorial now on Drupal.org that talks about creating a custom field. It doesn't get into necessarily compound fields like what I'm going to elaborate on here, but it shows you the basic structure and examples of how to create a custom field. And again, this is going to show you that you declare the info file for your module. You have the source directory. All of these 3 elements that I talked about for your field are going to be plugins. So they're going to live in the plugin directory. It's going to be a field plugin. It's going to use the field type as the base. So here we see the basic file structure for a new field module. So again, your 3 plugins that you're going to care about are going to be field type, field widget, and field formatter. So just to give you an idea of what these plugins do, the field type is going to tell Drupal about the field. It's going to be the thing that registers to Drupal, hey, we've got a new ingredient field. And it's going to also declare how each individual atomic element of that field works. It's going to talk about how it's stored. It's going to declare the database schema for the field itself. And so when our ingredient, it has the quantity, it has the unit, it has the name, it has all of these different individual data points, it's going to declare those in the schema. Next is going to be the field widget plugin. That's going to let users enter content. So when we talk about field widgets, these are plugins, and they can actually stand alone from field types and field formatters. But a field widget is the thing that you interact with in your browser when you're entering content. And finally, the field formatter is going to tell Drupal how to display all of the different atomic elements of your field, but it's going to give that field back to Drupal as a renderable molecule. It's going to be the thing responsible for rendering all of your atomic elements into the molecule itself. So step 1, we want to talk about defining the field type. So the first step is going to define our field and tell Drupal the basics about what our field does and what it stores. And 2 very important things are going to be the file location and the namespace. These are going to be relatively fixed. Just like any other namespace, you give it /Drupal / the name of your module, plugin, field type, and then the name of your class. It's very simple. But it follows a very distinct pattern, and Drupal is going to expect this for any field API defined field. So when you're defining the plugin, one of the first things you're going to do is create the annotation for your field type. Now, quick show of hands, just so I don't spend too much or I can spend more time on, for folks that are familiar with Drupal annotations or Symfony annotations. Okay, so a few of you. So if you're not already familiar with Drupal plugins, one of the first things that I want to warn you about or tell you about or make you be aware about, so that you'll make some of the mistakes that I've made, I want you to know about annotations. So they're important, and it's very often overlooked when you first develop your first plugin. despite how this looks, this is not just an arbitrary comment. This is not just a very helpful way for documentation to get generated later down the road. Don't make the mistake that I've made a couple of times of, oh, I'll just add this comment later once I get this code working, and then spend an hour trying to figure out why my code's not even showing up. So, so make sure that you create your annotation very first thing. Annotations, they're actionable code, and this is kind of a symphony thing. So it's important to know that they're not just comments. So when you define the field type schema, this is just kind of a default example here. This example of code, this is going to save exactly one column in our schema called value. And if you look under the hood at most fields in Drupal core, they're going to have just value, right? Like if you have a text field, it's going to have, field name dot value. If you have a number, it's going to be that field name dot value. It's a lot of times when you have this variable name, field underscore field name 0 value, it quite literally is referring to the value column in the database schema for that field type. And that's important to know, because when we're defining a compound fields database schema, you'll notice here we're defining quantity, unit, name, note. And so your variable is going to wind up looking like field underscore field name 0 name, or note, or quantity. Now I didn't try to define each column type for the sake of space on a slide. I didn't want to make this too code heavy. I just wanted you to be aware that the way quantity is abbreviated here, and the way unit is abbreviated here, is going to be very much like the full value array here, where you have to declare the type, the size, if it's null, all of the database schema values that you need to know. So in this database schema, we're declaring 4 data points that are going to be represented in our database table. And so it's going to be quantity, which is just going to be a text value, because you can have a range like 2 to 3 cups instead of, so we use text instead of integer. The unit, of course, is also going to be a text value. Well, the unit should be probably a floating point value, a numeric value of some sort. Node, of course, will be a text value as well. So in the database, what actually gets stored, you're going to have things like the field name, the entity ID that's using it, and instead of things like a column for value, you're going to have 4 individual columns in the same field row that line up to quantity, unit, name, and note. So when you're defining your field type, when you're working with your field type widget, your class, there's 3 basic methods that we're going to care about: schema, property definitions, and isEmpty. And like we talked about already with the schema, this is what tells Drupal what the columns in the database need to be. We're going to have the property definitions, which is just essentially an array to let you store field storage settings. And isEmpty, just like it sounds, it's going to be used to say yes or no that the data storage is empty for this field or not. And that's mostly used when you're deleting a field, because Drupal is going to complain if you try to delete or change a field that already has content in the database. So the second step after you create the field type is to create the field widget. So the next plugin is the field widget. So this is how we're going to capture our data and how we're going to get input from the user. And again, the file location and the namespace have a set pattern that you're going to want to follow. The namespace here happens to differ to denote that this is a field widget. Again, we have an annotation for our field widgets. We're declaring the ID of the field widget as ingredient. You give it a label. But one interesting thing to note is that you have the field types array of your annotation. What's interesting about this is that your field type and your field widgets don't necessarily have to line up together. You can have a field widget that would let you apply your field widget to other field types as well. So depending on what values you're able to capture in your field widget, you can apply your field widget to, say, a text field type. So this widget here can be used for more than just the ingredient. It can apply to any other existing field type that happens to capture the same sort of data. This is why sometimes you can have 3 or 4 field widget options for the same field type. This is also, by the way, if you wanted to create a standalone field widget module for creating say like a more attractive jQuery form widget for some ugly field that you don't like, you can create just this and it'll stand alone without having to have a field type defined. So when we define the field widget form itself, because that's primarily what we're going to care about, a field widget is going to define a form that then gets inserted into the node edit form. You can think of it that way. For the sake of space on the slide, I've abbreviated all the field element definitions for this ingredient field widget, but you could think of this as like any other form API form. So if you've created form API forms, this is going to be really simple stuff. What you're doing is you're defining the form for just the element itself. You kind of want to make sure that your form API types line up with your schema. It's not a requirement, but it's going to be really handy to make sure that anything is going to pass form validation for you automatically. So I should note that even though this example is a kind of a straightforward form, you can choose to have any form element at all. You can use form attach to attach JavaScript and CSS libraries to the widget to give you something that's a completely new and different feel. This is how you would create a JavaScript-based widget for your form element. It's also good maybe at this point to start attaching some CSS because even if you're just going to use the standard form elements from Drupal, you might want to use some CSS to align them all in the same row to kind of make better use of space in the node edit form. So the settings related methods that you see here, they're all going to be relatively optional depending on your widget's needs. But the main things to point out about classes here, the form element defines the widget itself and includes the form elements. So this is the form element method is going to be the thing that spits back the form that you're actually going to be editing later. Validate, of course, is just like any other form validator. This validator is going to be expected to be part of your class, and it's going to automatically execute any code validation for your form element. And then you have these other settings-related methods. So the third step, of course, after the field type and the field widget, we're going to talk about the field formatter. So again, you have your file location, you have your namespace. Things differ slightly, but it still follows the same pattern. So our annotation for a field formatter is going to look very similar to the field widget formatter. I don't demonstrate this here when I talk about the field types that this field formatter could apply for. But again, the field formatter can apply to any existing field in Drupal. It doesn't necessarily have to be for the field that we've defined in our field type. So that's just something else to point out. So you can actually create a custom field formatter for an existing field type, for an existing field widget. It doesn't matter. You can make a standalone field formatter. That's the nice thing about the plugins in Drupal 8, that they can all act standalone. So the field formatter is going to work on the entire field. It's going to treat it as a single molecule, and each element's delta is going to be the next field value. So if you're dealing with field cardinality, if you're allowing fields to have more than one value on your content type, that's going to be your delta in the code sample here. So the item inside the loop, inside this for each loop, is going to be a single row of that field. You'll notice that we use the item arrow quantity, the item arrow unit, and so on to display the individual atomic elements of our field. And so that's how you're going to access each individual value or each individual data point, as opposed to something like if it was item arrow value for a more standard field. So the end result of this particular method is that it's going to return a renderable array of the field instance. So that's going to take all of the field values from each row. It's going to take all of the rows if you have multiple cardinality for your field. And it's going to take all of that and give you back that as a renderable array. In this particular case, we're just using the markup option to just quickly show our field. But you can actually use a theme function instead of using markup. So the settings related methods, again, are going to be optional, and it's going to depend on your widget's needs. The view elements method is the main method that we care about. That's the code sample that I just showed you. And that's going to return a renderable array of your entire field. And of course, the handling settings for your field's output. That's what the rest of these methods are for. I'm going to kind of gloss over those for the sake of time. So I kind of alluded to a minute ago, theming your field. Of course, Drupal's default template suggestions mean that you can have a templates directory inside of your fields module and use the field -- ingredient twig file to theme the output of your field. Drupal is always going to look at these in a directory called templates at the root of your module or your theme. You'll notice that a lot of times in, when you're editing twig files, you'll have the @namespace/ and the name of a twig file that you want to import or embed. And that namespace is going to be, the module name / templates. That's what it's going to help you find. So if you have a templates directory, you can put the field -- ingredient.twig.html file in your templates directory of your module, and Drupal will just automatically find it. You can also put it in subdirectories if you want. So in addition to just creating the template, you can create a new theme function, just like any other element in Drupal. In this particular case, we're creating a theme function called ingredient. That's going to be our theme key. And we're going to simply just pass it our 4 atomic values. And if we wanted to, you could use one set of data points that gets stored in your field schema, and you can do some data transformations in your field formatter and then pass that completely separate set of variables as values to your theme function for output. So you can think of your field formatter almost as a transformation factory for your particular field. So if you look at this again, so here we see the field widget. This is the thing that we're interacting with. So each row across the top is one instance of our field widget. Our recipe content type has an ingredient field with infinite cardinality. That's how we get the add another item button at the bottom. And then we have the 4 atomic field elements that we've been looking at, which those get stored in the database as part of our field storage database table, which is the schema that was originally defined in the field type. So here's an example of a themed recipe page. So with our field formatter and just a very super simple field template that puts all of those things side by side in one row, kind of pretties it up a little bit with some color, you can style each individual ingredient for our recipe. So I've got a little bit of time to talk about some of the other options that you have. So we talked about paragraphs as one option. That's probably going to be the most common use case. And then we talked about custom field modules using Field API. So some other things that are out there that you could possibly use are going to be entity construction kit and inline entity form. Those 2 modules kind of go hand in hand. But I should point out that if you use those, they're going to do a lot of the same thing that paragraphs do, but they don't allow for revisions. So that's something that you probably want to keep in mind. And I don't think translations work very well with it either. Field collections is another module that's been around for a really long time. It actually predates paragraphs in Drupal 7, but in Drupal 8, it's been kind of conceding the victory to paragraphs there. Bricks is another module that is worth mentioning because there's always the potential that in years' time, it could be a really valuable module. It does some things very similar to paragraphs, but it's really more akin to messing around with blocks. It's really kind of more of a competitor with Panelizer. And it kind of reminds me a little bit of Beans, for those of you that used Beans in Drupal 7, which Beans, of course, in Drupal 8, they're just saying use blocks because those are fieldable now, and you can have block types. So this was just kind of an example of exploring some other options. There's a really interesting blog post from chapter 3. You can just go to their website and search for ECK and IEF in comparison to paragraphs. The site builder experience is a little bit more complicated, although content editing is as easy as paragraphs. But for the most part, Entity Creation Kit and these things, they don't support revisions, and so they become problematic for any kind of editorial workflow, although they otherwise will work well with search. So in this particular case, if you're evaluating one set of modules over the other, I'm going to tell you hands down every time paragraphs are probably the way you want to go. So I try to run things a little quickly just for the sake of time. I know we started a little bit late, and I didn't want to run into the next module, but I did also want to allow time for questions. If there were any questions about the code samples or any other examples of use cases that you might have. Yeah?
For you, which will be the theme, okay, we're going to do our custom field, we're going to do our paragraph. Because most of the time paragraph will just do it.
Mm-hmm.
But once again, you will say, okay, this needs to be a custom field.
Okay, so your question is basically, when should I use a paragraph type versus creating a whole new module, which can, yeah, so it's a good question. So in the past, I probably would have gone to the custom module almost every time because of performance reasons. It was, you're dealing with creating a field that is very native to Drupal, as opposed to paragraph, which is, it's a site builder's tool for creating an entity that then gets placed on nodes. But in Drupal 8, because of entity caching and the way entity referencing all works, it's going to perform just as well. So I'm going to tell you probably 80 to 90% of the time, you're actually going to be interested in using paragraphs for creating your very simple compound field types. So the recipe, the ingredient example that we talk about here could have just as easily been built with paragraphs. The cases where you might want to create a custom module for Field API, for using that approach, is going to be really important when the thing that gets input by the user and the thing that gets output to the end user are going to be different. So in paragraphs, you have, I'm going to have that quote. I'm going to have an image. I'm going to have a block of text. I'm going to have the author, right? And then those three same fields get output over here in the rendering engine. But if if I have, let's say, 3 fields where I add this number and then add this number and then add this number, and the thing over here that I want is going to be the sum of those 3 numbers, you're probably going to be better off creating a custom field. That's kind of a simple example. But anytime you're going to have to do a lot of data transformation on the fields that get input versus how that information is output, that's going to be the sort of like red flag that, yeah, you should probably be creating your own custom field, or at least your own custom formatter or widgets. Does that help? Okay. Okay, yeah, right here.
Yeah, maybe kind of try to go to the race Drupal 8. So how it works? You use components.
Okay, so your question is more about like if you're using like the REST API part of Drupal. So if you have a headless Drupal, for instance. Yeah, so it's a good question. I'm not entirely sure about a couple of pieces, but essentially your custom compound field, if you're creating a field through the field API method, it's going to be exactly like any other field. So you need to make sure that your field formatter is capable of producing, JSON, the JSON form elements. But generally speaking, the field API is going to handle a lot of that for you. If you think about how addresses look, in a RESTful output, it's going to be very similar to that. Paragraphs also work pretty well with REST. As long as you don't rely too heavily on changing the output in say like you would have a paragraph template in a standard install of Drupal to change how the paragraph, all the field elements get rendered. As long as you don't rely too much on that, it should work just fine in a RESTful environment. Okay, any other questions? All right, well, thank you all for your time. I hope you were able to learn something from it.